I think sometimes the perfectionist narrative can often be manipulated to be like, oh, well, we have absolutely no responsibility then. And it's like, no, we still have responsibility to do the best that we can, but we're not going to start coming for each other just because we don't all agree.
Okay. Hi, Tori. How are you doing?
I am, well, a bit warm, a bit too warm for my liking, but
Yeah.
well, nevertheless.
Yay. So I'm really excited to have the opportunity to just sit down and chat to you about your book. Um I literally just devoured it and it was so challenging but also so honest and raw,
Mm.
and I thought, my goodness, this must have taken a lot out of you when you were writing.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think every writing process can be cathartic for anybody who decides to embark on this journey. But for me in particular, it actually felt like a really big relief,
Yeah.
and release. And I feel as though it really gave me the space to talk about all the things that I'd been bottling up for a very long time, maybe even mulling over, having small conversations here and there. And it almost felt like a bit of a statement to put out this book and say, okay, well, this is how I feel about these things. And next time I'm ever in a situation where I'm like, okay, I don't agree with, how you view the climate crisis or like how you choose to view marginalized people in this
Oh,
conversation, read this book,
100%.
and I hope that it
Yes.
can put you on the right track.
I think so too. I feel like it's one of those books that um if you have difficulty engaging in conversation, or like
Mhm.
you're a little worried about how confrontation would go, you, instead of hitting a
Exactly.
wall with someone, you just say, well, can I just suggest this book to you and just try it out, figure out how
Yeah.
you want to engage with this, because it's not a made up situation. Like, you have
Right.
stats, you have
Yeah.
lived realities, you have yeah, you laid it out so nicely. I think, I guess for me, before we even carry on, for those who haven't read the book, do you want to give us like a brief synopsis
Yeah.
of it? Yeah.
So it's called It's Not Just You, and the book explores the intersections between climate change and mental health. I kind of use the subtitle How to Navigate Eco-Anxiety as a bit of a catfish, just
Mhm.
because eco-anxiety, if we're talking about mainstream understandings of mental health and climate change, is probably the most well-known term. But I think this is a book which is an invitation to actually go beyond eco-anxiety and to also really create space for the narratives that are often left out of the picture, which I think is quite symbolic, really, because if we look at any historical and ongoing movement, we can see that people who experience the brunt of it are often left out of the conversation.
100%.
And so, yeah, this book is really an invitation to go beyond that and to really humanize, I think, some of the struggles that people have when it comes to the climate crisis.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And could you walk us through your research process a little bit, and obviously maybe your, like, what inspired you to decide to just put it all down in words?
Mm. I think a lot of it is really informed by the activism that I've been doing over the last decade or so, and I guess the literature and the experiences that I've kind of consumed and been a part of throughout that period. But before I was in the realm of activism, I was actually a scientist and a research scientist, and my sort of hope was to complete a PhD. So back in 2017, I had a PhD lined up, and I was really sure that I was gonna, go
Yeah.
do the sort of academic stuff, be part of the
Yeah.
academic world, be a scientist. And I got really disillusioned, I think, with the impact that I was having and the sort of impact of my own scientific research. And so I thought to myself, okay, maybe the key is in communicating scientific research. And, I've kind of taken a little bit with of that with my work, throughout the years. But most importantly, I think I do feel as though those research skills that I had in the past have really benefited me in
Mm.
this book because sometimes we need the science to communicate the severity of the climate crisis. But as I've also outlined in the book, it's not just the
It's
science, it's
not
also,
just the science, yeah.
right, it's also the social justice and lived realities of people who have been enduring this struggle. So yeah, it was really a sort of way that I kind of married two worlds, the two sides of me that I think I really cared about. The activism side, which I think is more practical and based on lived reality, and then the scientific communication, which is obviously important, but yeah, how do we do justice to stories in a way that doesn't just solely rely on facts and figures?
Yes, yes. And I think one part that you did that really well was it's not just Monday.
Mm.
Like you brought stats that was staggering. I think it was I think just the fact that we always I experience Sunday scaries every
Mm.
Sunday. It's terrifying to think of, like, oh gosh,
Yeah,
another Monday.
right, right.
And the cost of living crisis and people like having to just keep on keeping on, and this like burnout culture, and we have to keep pushing. And
Mm.
yet 30-40 years ago, people were working the same number of hours, earning more, and were able to buy houses, and we're like
Mm.
working double hours or like having two jobs and still renting and trying our very best. It's fascinating how you brought that to life. I think I deeply resonated with it. It felt
Yeah.
like, my gosh, all these people who keep telling me if I just cut out avo toast and a
Right.
latte, I'll buy a mansion. And
Right.
that's not realistic.
It's not realistic at all. And I think that chapter to me really speaks about like just how intertwined things like climate change are with the systems, because I often say that for me, sustainability is as much about greening the planet as it is about pacing ourselves and learning how to live a
100%.
good life that isn't excessive and burning people out to the bone. Because I
Yeah.
think that that's also part of the culture that we're in, right? We've created a culture of the climate crisis. We've created a culture of the mental health crisis. And those cultures are deeply embedded in the work system. So how do we move away from that? I think it's like being conscious of it is the first step.
Yeah.
Um, and then finding ways to subvert it is,
Yeah.
to me, a very radical act.
Yeah. You actually touched on right towards the end of the book. I liked where you were speaking about um I think it was imagination as radical.
Mm, yeah,
uh Remind me again. It's so basically you're
yeah,
looking at the idea of abolition and then dismantling a whole system to build a new one. And part of that was also being using radical imagination. Could you like
yeah,
maybe elaborate on that? Because I
yeah.
thought that was
So
great.
yeah, radical imagination is a practice, as you've mentioned, that has long been used by marginalized communities, specifically those within the abolition movement. And I think the thing that I love the most about how people talk about radical imagination is it's not just about tearing things down, it's also about building anew. Like, what does it look like to live a life of your wildest dreams, right? Like, what does it mean for people to be happy, healthy, in community, live on a planet where they're not treated as commodities, but they're treated as human beings? For me, that's like such an important thing. And I think a lot of scholars and activists over the years have said anything less than that is not worth your time. And I think when
100%.
you're in a movement that fights against something that can be so violent, it's important to remind yourself that, there is this hope that we have and that there is something better out there. And
Yeah.
I think radical imagination kind of keeps your sense of self grounded, but also means that you kind of look to the future for something better. So
Yeah.
it's almost like a compass, I would say.
Oh, I like that. I
Mm.
like that. Yeah, like a guiding light. Like, okay, this is
Yeah,
where we're trying to get
exactly.
to. Um,
Yeah,
and it was so interesting also to just think about how sometimes the blame is shifted on the individual.
right.
And there's, I think, part of that eco anxiety is for me when I was thinking about it, it does feel like my goodness, I haven't recycled enough, or where else can
Mm,
I cut my emissions? And yet, like 71% of the emissions are being done by 100 companies or something like that, which
yeah,
just is shocking.
yeah.
Like, how is that happening? How how is it possible that that's the first time I've, engaged with that stat? And
Mm.
why is it not, why are people not enraged?
Right. I love how you talk about the rage there because for me, like rage is a really powerful emotion, and I'm talking about like mental health and climate change, right? But
Mm,
for me, like the way that we feel in our bodies, in our minds, in our souls,
mm,
can be such a powerful catalyst to acting. And yeah, I think I do speak a lot about systems perspectives just because as individuals, it's really hard for us to ever be perfect. I mean, we live in an imperfect world. How could we
yeah,
ever possibly be perfect?
yeah.
And I think that narrative of individualism is also tied up to perfectionism, which makes people feel like they're not good enough and therefore they can't do anything. But it's completely what they want you to believe. Like these
Mm-hmm.
71 companies, right?
Mm-hmm.
100
Mm-hmm.
companies, sorry, want to
100
make you
companies,
feel
yeah.
like you're powerless. Because guess what? It makes them more money when we feel like we can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
So it's something that's really disempowering to think, oh, I'm this individual and I can't make a difference. But actually, when you start to think about it from a systems perspective and start to think about being collaborative, there are endless possibilities. And I've seen changes happen in the movements that I've been in. So that's been really exciting. And also, how did we get to this point? Well, there's a system that exists, and that system permits people to make so much money to the point of hurting other people and hurting this planet. And if we're not rectifying the system, then all we're doing is kind of like slapping a band-aid on it and hoping that it doesn't get worse, but that doesn't get it at the core. So this book is really a call to arms to really address things radically, which comes from the Latin word meaning radic, root. Um,
Ah,
yeah, a lot of
wow.
people think radical just means burning stuff and tearing stuff down, and it can be, but
Mm,
actually radical means getting to the root of things. And for
wow.
me, we're not going to get to the root of the mental health and climate crisis if we're just still creating the same systems that are going to continue harming people.
Yeah. What would you say to someone who is just coming to terms with their eco anxiety, or
Mm,
have just stepped into activism, and maybe they're a little scared,
yeah,
and they're not ready to, make a placard, or,
yeah,
because a lot of people trivialize just sharing a post on Instagram, which could be incredibly
mm,
terrifying for someone,
yeah.
if depending on who their following is. I guess what would be a word of encouragement to someone who's just starting out and speaking out against what's been going on this planet?
In keeping with the book title, I always remind people that it's not just you. Like,
Yeah,
there's so many people who are going through what you're experiencing at the moment. So many people who are at the start of their journey, and I think anyone coming to terms with that, like it's really commendable.
yeah,
Because it is scary. Like what we're experiencing is terrifying. And I think it's really important for people to remember that I wasn't always aware and that I was kind of, someone who was kind of just going through life being like, hey, okay, why I don't really know what's going on, the climate crisis.
mm,
But once I came to realize what was happening, my body experienced like a whole series of like shocks. I was like, oh my goodness, like, how have I not known about the severity of this? Like, time's running out, all of these different things. I went through stages of grief
yeah,
almost.
yeah,
But the important thing is that I didn't go through that alone,
yeah,
which has really helped in my journey.
yeah,
And I would always say to anyone who's going through this, like, make sure to find like-minded people who understand the severity of what we're going through and be in community, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to save us. And that's who we organize with. So, yeah, feel those feelings out. You're completely valid for feeling them, and try and find like-minded people who can support you along the way.
one example that you had in your book was about the mushroom system in a forest.
Mm,
That was such a beautiful, it was such beautiful imagery. Um, so for those of you who haven't read it, could you maybe elaborate on that a bit or just bring it to
Yeah.
life for us?
So I see myself as part of what's called a mycelial network. And what that means essentially is that in a forest, you might come across a mushroom. And what you see is this, what we call a fruiting body, which appears above the surface of the ground. But actually, fungi and mushrooms are much bigger than what the eye can see. They exist almost like an underground network of roots, which we call mycelium. And for me, I always see that activist movements or anybody who organizes or does anything in community is kind of like a mycelial network. We share information and resources, and we grow and we, die back and we evolve and become, completely transformed.
Mm.
And I kind of see myself a little bit sometimes like a little mushroom. Like some people know who I am in this space because I occupy a public facing position. But the
Mhm.
reality is I would be nothing without my community. Like there is
Sure.
so much to be said about how there are less visible roles in this movement that people occupy. And one thing I love is that my friend Tolly, who's also a climate activist, says you can be a climate activist even if you make tea for people at meetings. Like that's still activism.
Exactly.
Right? You can be a climate activist if you take care of somebody else, or if you do drawings, or if you use your skills on social media, or if you're someone who likes to do art. Like there's so many different ways to take action. And I think the mycelial community reminds me of that because yeah, we're not anything unless we're in community.
Talking about community, do you know, tell us about the Bad Activist Collective?
Yeah, so it used to exist as a more sort of formed collective of activists, but with the world that is incredibly burning out and tiresome, we exist more as an ethos now, which I think is probably still healthy to
Mm.
remind ourselves of. And the bad activist ethos is that we are not limited by our pursuit of perfectionism. We try and deconstruct this myth that activists have to be perfect,
Yeah.
and that as a collective, we strive for accountability. I think sometimes the perfectionist narrative can often be manipulated to be like, oh, well, we have absolutely no responsibility then. And it's like, no, no, we still have responsibility to do the best that we can, but we're not going to start coming for each other just because we don't all agree or
100%.
because we don't think we're good enough. Like for me, for instance, I think that bad activism, which is a play off of Roxane Gay's bad feminism, by the way,
Mhm.
um, is an opportunity to see ourselves as fully human and to recognize that if you're a human, you're going to be imperfect. So
Yeah.
it's almost quite freeing. It allows you to see
Mm.
someone's humanity fully.
I think it also creates space for people to be an activist in the capacity that they can be without feeling like they um, have to be the kind of activists they see on in
Right.
mainstream media, for example.
Exactly.
Like in the one chapter, it's not just Greta. This it goes back to that individualization
Mm,
where that people make you feel like if you're not this way, if you're not this kind of activist, then you're not an
exactly.
activist at all. And I think I'd rather subscribe to the bad activist kind
Right.
of thinking
Exactly.
and just let me do my activism in the capacity that I can. And it's okay if it
Exactly.
doesn't look like something that people have seen on social media or something that's particularly shareable. And really
Exactly.
it is something as simple as making tea for others. Everyone
Yeah,
has a role and
truly.
uh everyone has their limit and that's okay. It's also about that radical self-love and self-care,
100%.
taking care of yourself as you're engaging in activism to ensure that you don't burn out. Because I think
Right.
that would be like I think that's the goal, right? In my mind, I'm thinking corporates have so many people and so much money
Right.
as
Exactly.
individuals and as movements, we're more likely to burn out than them if we don't know how to take care of ourselves and pace ourselves and give each other room to ebb
For
and
real.
flow. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel you on that, seriously. I think it's so important for us to really, again, as I mentioned, like see this as a sustainable fight. Like, how can
100%.
I possibly do this work for the rest of my life if I'm treating my body like it's disposable?
Sure. Yeah. And you know what I was, so I'm based in Cape Town, and and it's Cape Town, South Africa, and I'm so thankful to read a book that was published in the global north that was talking so unabashedly about the global south and the
Mm,
erasure of lived experiences of the global majority.
yeah.
And just like unapologetic. So that was
Mhm.
huge for me. You know, I had previously read Vanessa Nakate's book, and she did highlight a lot of that, but it was so refreshing to see a book that is so widespread, that is going to have so much reach, bringing to the forefront lived realities of people that we just don't see in mainstream media. What was your thinking when you wrote about those narratives, or when you reached out to those activists and decided to incorporate it into the book?
I think that, as I've kind of mentioned, when we talk about climate justice, this means racial justice, this means social justice, and it means that understanding that those who are on the front lines of the climate crisis are those who are going to be most impacted. And most of those narratives come from the global south,
Yeah.
who have long resisted violence, extraction, and oppression. And I don't think anybody can solve the climate crisis if we're not going to talk about how this impacts the global south, if we're not going to talk about the inequalities that exist within it. And with a conversation around mental health, like that's a climate justice issue. So it deserves the same attention and care. And I feel like in the climate movement or in the environmental movement, I think my friend Michaela touched on this really well. And she's Jamaican. And
Mm.
she said, for a long time, I didn't feel like the climate movement was for me
Sure.
because as a Black woman
Mm.
who now lives in the UK,
Mm.
I thought it was just for hippie white people. And then she talks
Yeah.
about how understanding the interconnection between extraction, white supremacy, and the fossil fuel industry, she was like, oh, wait, no, this crisis is deeply rooted in human exploitation,
Oh
in
yeah.
racialized
Oh
exploitation.
yeah.
And if you acknowledge that as an activist, you begin to see that it is everywhere. Yet the narratives that I see, even where I am in the UK, which is considered kind of a progressive climate community, they see it as a distraction. They're like, oh, it's too
Sure.
complicated. And I'm like, it's everything. Like, you're not going to be fighting for an equitable world if you ignore these realities. And I've read a lot of books about mental health and climate change, but very few have spoken about that disparity.
Mm-hmm.
Very few have actually centered voices that have been on the front lines and who have been organizing for change.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like it would be a huge disservice to those communities and to my friends to
Yeah.
not talk about these realities and also not use my platform in a way that um, really uplifted these stories. I think that, getting to write a book is a real privilege. And what good is that privilege if you don't support other people or if you don't actually get to the crux of the matter? And I think that from my own lived realities as well, like growing up in a coastal town, which has deep political instability, I saw the little slice of that injustice in my own life. And I thought, okay, well, I've got this. Imagine how it must be for other people.
Mm.
And I think it's really important to tap into what you know and use that as a way to foster solidarity and empathy for other people. So that's why it was such an important part of the book. It underscores the whole book, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just hoping that, if I'm very honest, the book's primary market is people in the global north who
Yeah.
see climate justice as confusing.
Yeah.
And if we can get them to understand that, then I'm hoping that this movement moves in the right direction.
Exactly. I think getting this book in the hands of as many people in the global north as possible
Yeah.
will completely, I feel like it's going to shake a lot of misunderstandings. It's going to bring to light a lot of things that people might not necessarily have realized. I suppose you don't know what you don't know.
Right. You
And
don't know what you
having,
don't know sometimes.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't know
Yeah.
what you don't know. But I also think that like this is a good reason to be like, okay, I don't know what I don't know, but there's more that I can do. And here's what I can do. Or I misunderstood this prior and now I can understand this. And I think a really good example of that is like eco-anxiety is a very real thing, but I don't want it to make people who have the most privilege feel like they can't do anything to help other people.
Yeah.
Because unfortunately, I've met a lot of, I'm going to say just white environmentalists who have been extremely eco-anxious to the point where they're like, oh, I don't have capacity to do anything. I can't care about anybody other than myself. And I'm like, that's not helping anybody. You know, like we have a duty to do more. And if we look historically at which countries have caused the most climate damage, it's those in the global north. So there is a real responsibility, and we can't shy away from that responsibility. So this is a book that I think is lovingly saying to people, you gotta catch up, you
Yeah.
know?
There's a lot of work to be done.
Right. But do it in community because
Do
that's
it in community
accountability
and
and
don't
that's
burn
support.
yourself
Right.
out. There's
Mm-hmm.
ways to do this with
Right.
people, and you're not alone. And
Yes.
many people are, yeah, exactly. I guess many people are feeling what you're feeling. You're not alone. You can rely on others while you're doing this fight. And I
Exactly.
think uh, what was interesting was realizing the global north. I forgot who said this. I think it might be Lie, the activist Lie,
Mm,
about the global north says, I think, therefore I am. And then, but you know,
yeah.
on the African continent, we ascribe to Ubuntu, which is
Right.
I am because you are. And
Right.
you know,
Right.
a lot of the activist movements that have continued on over time and have resisted kind of burning out or fizzling away, like Black Lives Matter,
Mm,
like the fight for racial justice, was because people were working in community and they were
right.
filling the gap where others could not, you know. So stepping back, we need to step
Yeah.
back, moving forward. And I think what happens in certain movements in the global north
Right.
is because it's not inherently part of the culture or part of the way of
Right.
being.
Yeah.
It's there is a propensity to just lean on being the individual and not realizing like it's okay
Right.
to be part of a community and a part of a movement.
Yeah, 100%. And you think about the cultures that may have existed many, many years ago, they've been eradicated in
Yeah.
the global north. They've also been eradicated in the global south, but we still have indigenous people and black people in particular
Yeah.
resisting these oppressions. And I think that's why I'm really grateful to the work of Mary Hagler, who is an American climate justice activist and author who talks about how actually Black liberation struggles and the movements from the US can teach a lot of communities about what it means to be resilient. And I
Mm.
think that for me is really important, even as like a light-skinned woman of color, to appreciate that we have a lot to learn from
Yeah.
these communities because when you have something which isn't your first existential threat, like when the climate crisis isn't your first existential threat, that says a lot about the capacity to organize and the
Mm-hmm.
capacity to be in community. Whereas for a lot of communities here in the global north, the climate crisis is their first existential
Yeah.
threat. And they're like, we don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's also why eco-anxiety is kind of sometimes attributed to like upper middle class white people.
Um,
The reality is that these stresses are being felt all around the world,
yeah.
and that those who are, you know, invisibilized tend to be from the global north, tend to be people of color.
Yeah.
But also at the same time, their struggle is kind of a different one because it's not the first struggle they've had. but it only adds to the struggle that they have. Whereas for a lot of people in the global north, it's just like, I don't know what to do. I've never had to think about anything other than this in my life.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really important narrative because I talk a lot about resilience, and it's not this like toxic portrayal of like you have to struggle to be, resilient, but it's this kind of understanding that there's a lot to learn, and that as a climate justice movement, we have a right to understand the efforts of those who have long fought for social justice. And I'm hoping that, folks who see a bit of themselves in these stereotypes maybe will kind of look inwards and go, okay, I need to check myself and actually listen and learn and be in community, because there is no way we're going to be able to solve something like this without leaning on each other.
No. And I think we need to act sooner rather than later. The crisis, Vanessa said, it's not a ticking time bomb. Like it's exploded. It's happened. It's happening. We're living in the moment right now. It's not something that's imminent. It is continuing to happen. And just because it's not particularly on everyone's doorstep just yet, doesn't mean it's not already happening all around the world. There's typhoons, there's landslides, there's like, we need to start doing something now. And it's not just
I think that's why for me, one of my, I wouldn't go like, oh, it was my favorite chapter, but it was for me one of the most important chapters to write was It's Not Just the Future. Because I think far too often mental health worries are revolving around the future. And as Vanessa had said, this has been something that many people on the front lines have been experiencing for a long time. And I think when I was writing about some of the floods that were happening in Europe, all of the commentaries were like, oh, the climate crisis is finally here. It's like finally here for you, maybe. Why does that only matter now? And I think people in the global north have a duty to recognize that just because it's happening to you now doesn't mean that it didn't matter before.
That's hard. I mean, it's a hard reality to face, but I think it's one that does need to be faced. And I think the tone with which you wrote your book was not shaming anyone into doing something or into action. It was just very lovingly but firmly holding up a mirror and saying, this is what's happening. What do you want to do about this? Like, where do we go from here? And I guess for me, my question is, now that you've written this book, like, where to? Like, what's next for you?
As an author or an activist, or
as an author, I mean, I think, you know what? Actually, no, I take that back. As an activist, because I think this book is going to bring people who might not have been into the climate crisis space from mainstream into it. And I guess this could be a starter book. So what does this mean for you as an activist going forward? Because you might be
to practice what I preach, which is
community,
like I can't write something and then not live to its values, and that means turning inwards, turning to my global community, and also my local one. I always say, think global, act local. And I think that for me, being in community with climate folks who are organizing for a climate just future is really imperative, and doing what I can to lend support to those communities is really important. And I think from the perspective of the book and the teachings that it has, I'd love to find ways to share those teachings that don't just come in the form of a book, because I think not everyone has the capacity to read a book of that length, and it might not necessarily translate for people, but maybe just an advisory capacity to support people who really want to do better, and to actually connect them to activists who have these realities and find ways to support them. This book was a community project, and full disclaimer, like that wealth that I earn from it is being redistributed, because I think it's really important
Amazing.
to not just have this platform and not actually walk the walk. So for me, it's really important that like funding is redistributed, and I'd love to find ways to continue to support communities who need that kind of funding. I'm working on a few projects at the moment with an indigenous community in Brazil, and some friends of mine who, are really trying to find funding to build an indigenous community house for those who need to travel to and from the city, because unfortunately most political change happens in the city, so they need places to stay. And I think for the next few months, foreseeable months, that's what I'm going to be helping towards. And I always say like it has a mental health theme, the book, but to me, supporting communities with like housing or basic income or food and rent or whatever is mental health care.
Yeah.
I think we need to go beyond just thinking that mental health is just this thing that we're responsible for, that is basically simply solved by us,
Yeah.
meditating. I mean, I do obviously support these things that help people, or never want to take that away from anybody. But
Yeah.
we also have to be realistic and think, actually, why are people mentally unwell? Are
Yeah.
they being discriminated against in society? Are they able to access safety and shelter? Because that's traumatic for people. So yeah, I'm hoping that the activism that I do is kind of in keeping with some of those practices.
Stunning. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
This has been so enriching,
Thank
and
you.
I'm really grateful that you wrote this book.
Thank you
Um,
for reading it. Yeah, that means a lot.